guys? Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, a while back, I made a video discussing which villains I feel could potentially return when it comes to Dragons Rising, taking a look at the various villains that we've gotten over the years and discussing their chances of showing up in this latest era of Ninjago. That was a video that I really enjoyed making, and in today's video, I want to do a pseudo part 2 to that video, this time though, going over the side characters and talking about their chances of returning in Dragons Rising. So, let's get into this whole thing. Now, before we actually get into the video and discuss the characters, I feel like there's a few things that I need to go over first. For starters, just like with the villains video, I'm going to be splitting up the characters into 4 separate categories. The first category being the characters who I think will return in Dragons Rising, the second category being the characters who I think are likely to return, the third category being the characters who I think could return, and finally the fourth category being the characters who I think won't return in Dragons Rising. Also, I want you guys to keep in mind, this is by no means going to be a comprehensive list of every single side character. We'd be here forever if I were to take a look at every single individual side character that's appeared across the franchise and I went over their chances of returning in Dragons Rising. And instead, I'm going to be going over some of the more noteworthy side characters when it comes to the franchise. So I'm sorry if there's a character who you guys wanted me to cover who I didn't, because again, I'm not going to be taking a look at every single character, but let's say that when it comes to any of the characters who I don't discuss, they will automatically go in the category of could return when it comes to the characters. And finally, one last thing that I want to go over, when it comes to my personal knowledge of Dragons Rising, it's going to be going up to Season 3, Part 1, because, as I've stated multiple times, I have not seen any of the leaked episodes for Season 3, Part 2 yet, so I do not know if any of the characters who I discuss in this video do show up in that chapter of Dragons Rising. I don't know, because again, I haven't seen the episodes yet. So if I bring up a character and they did show up in Season 3, Part 2, again, I was not aware of that. I haven't seen the episodes yet. And so, finally, with all that out of the way, let's get into discussing the characters finally. Now, before we take a look at the characters in the various categories, there's actually something that I want to go over first, and that would be the characters who have already shown up in Dragons Rising. And in total, there have been 6 side characters who have appeared in Dragons Rising, not including Wu and Pixel, because the 2 of them aren't technically side characters, even though they are. What I mean by that, with the 2 of them not being side characters, is that the 2 of them are part of the ninja team. This is strictly going to be characters who aren't on the team. And when it comes to those 6 characters, they include Chancellor Gulch from Master of the Mountain, 4 Ultra Elemental Masters, with those obviously being Paleman, Tox, Camille, and Nero, and finally, Dareth. Those have been the 6 side characters who all have already shown up in Dragons Rising, so now let's take a look at all of the other side characters. So, starting off, we have the characters who I think will return in Dragons Rising, and in total, there's 3 characters who I believe will show up at some point during the events of Dragons Rising, with those 3 characters being Skylar, Faith, and Akita. I think all 3 of these characters will appear at some point during the events of Dragons Rising. Starting off with Skylar, I feel like it's safe to say she will be showing up at some point during Dragons Rising, given the fact that out of all the Elemental Masters that we've seen when it comes to the original show, as well as in Dragons Rising, I feel like it's safe to say Skylar is definitely the most popular out of all of them, as well as the one who's most prominently used over the events of the show, given her very frequent appearances that she's made over and over again when it comes to the franchise. I mean, even if you're someone who doesn't like Skylar, it is hard to deny that she is a fairly popular character when it comes to the show, and so again, I feel like it would make a lot of sense for her to show up, given just how much of a popular character she is. Not to mention, when it comes to Skylar, she is also Kai's love interest when it comes to the show, and given how Kai's story in Quest for the Lost Powers ended with the 2 of them finally becoming a couple, I feel like it would make sense for Skylar to show up so we can actually see some stuff with the 2 of them as a couple on screen. I feel like that would make a lot of sense. Then again though, as I brought up in my video that I made a while back discussing Skylar, Doc Wyatt, one of the head writers for Ninjago, actually said that we don't want an update surrounding Kai and Skylar's relationship, suggesting that something potentially bad happened between the 2 of them. However, if anything, I think that's actually more of a reason behind why Skylar will show up, because I feel like it would make a lot of sense for her to return, so that way we can get some proper explanation behind what exactly did happen between her and Kai. And either way, I do honestly feel like when it comes to Skylar, she will show up at some point during Dragons Rising. Moving on to Faith and Akita, there's actually one major reason behind why I think these two characters will show up at some point during Dragons Rising, and it's that the two of them are from different realms. This is something that I brought up multiple times in the past, but I feel like it's safe to say the ninja will go to every single realm at some point during the events of Dragons Rising, and I honestly think that this would be a really good way for the show to bring back these other characters, because again, they're from other realms, and I feel like the ninja are gonna go to all the realms at some point during Dragons Rising. That being said, the ninja did go to the first realm during Season 3, Part 1, when they went to the First Lands, and Faith, and by extension the rest of the Dragon Hunters, didn't show up. But I feel like we could potentially see the ninja going back to the first realm at some point, maybe to find Faith and the Dragon Hunters in order to potentially learn more about the dragons. I feel like this would make a lot of sense because, as we saw at the end of Season 9 and during the events of Season 10, the Dragon Hunters became allies with the dragons, so I could totally see the ninja going to the Dragon Hunters in order to learn more about them, especially given that Faith has a connection with Firstborn, the mother of all dragons. She could share some really interesting information about the dragons. I feel like that would make a lot of sense. And when it comes to Akita, once again, this is something that I have brought up a lot when it comes to my channel, but the ending of Season 11 basically set up the idea of Akita returning. This is something that I have brought up so many times. But at the ending of Season 11, we hear Akita talking about the idea of her seeing Lloyd at some point in the future, and her thinking that Katara was wrong about him thinking that her and Lloyd aren't going to meet each other again at some point. And this is something that I and many other fans really want to see, especially considering the fact that it has been 6 years since we've actually gotten the ending of Season 11. It's something that has been pretty heavily anticipated by a lot of fans, us getting some proper payoff for this setup that we got. And I feel like when it comes to Dragons Rising, we could finally see it after all this time. We could finally see Akita be brought back into the show, and her and Lloyd could finally reunite. I feel like that's something that would make a lot of sense. Additionally, I feel like there's just a lot of story potential when it comes to Akita, and I still feel like there's a lot of things that the writers could do with her if they were to bring her back. It's something that I think would honestly be really cool to see. Plus, not to mention, again, there's the whole idea of her and Lloyd reuniting, and I think it would be great if we got the chance to see the show expand on their dynamic after the incredible stuff that we got during the events of Season 11. Again, it's something that I do honestly think would be really great to see. And also, one other thing that I want to bring up, and it's that if Akita were to return, then it would also make sense for the other NetherRealm characters to return as well. Although I don't think their chances of returning are as likely in comparison to Akita's chances. So let's say that when it comes to Kataru and Crag, because they were more prominent during the events of Season 11, the two of them are likely to return. Meanwhile, the rest of the NetherRealm characters all could return at some point in Dragons Rising. Speaking of the likely characters though, let's talk about them next. And in total, I believe that there are 7 characters who are likely to return at some point during Dragons Rising, with those characters being Karloff, Turner, Ronan, the police commissioner, Nelson, Antonia, and Vanya. I think all these characters do have a likely chance of returning at some point during Dragons Rising. Starting off with Karloff and Turner, the big reason why I think their return is likely when it comes to Dragons Rising is because of something that I've noticed when it comes to the original Elemental Masters. And it's that when it comes to the original Elemental Masters, there's essentially a hierarchy, so to say, when taking a look at the Elemental Masters in terms of things like their popularity and their prominence when it comes to the show, with there being 3 tiers in total when it comes to this hierarchy. At the top, you have Skylar as the only one in this tier, as again, the most popular Elemental Master and the one who's most prominently used when it comes to the show. In the second tier, this contains the Elemental Masters who aren't as popular as Skylar, but are still fairly well liked among the fan base and are semi-prominently used, with these Elemental Masters including Karloff, Turner, Nero, Paleman, and Shade. And finally, there's the third and final tier, which contains everybody else, all of the remaining Elemental Masters who aren't as popular and the characters who aren't as prominently used as the other Elemental Masters. And so when it comes to Karloff and Turner, again, the two of them fit in the second tier of being fairly popular characters who are semi-prominently used when it comes to the show. And so I could honestly see the two of them showing up at some point given that fact. And we have already seen 2 of the characters from that tier show up. We saw that in Season 2, Part 2 with Paleman and Nero showing up. So I could honestly see that happening when it comes to Karloff and Turner. And the reason why I don't include Shade here because he's also in that tier is because it's something that I'm going to get into later actually. But still, when it comes to Karloff and Turner, I think that their chances of returning are fairly likely. Moving on, when it comes to Ronin, I think his return is likely because we know his voice actor is going to be returning. When it comes to Ronin's voice actor, Brian Dobson, a while back on social media, he said that he would be returning to voice a character in Dragons Rising. Now, this doesn't outright confirm that Ronin will be returning at some point during Dragons Rising, given the fact that voice actors can and do voice multiple characters when it comes to Ninjago. I mean, when it comes to Brian Dobson, he's also the voice actor for Soul Archer, for example. So again, while it doesn't outright confirm that Ronin will be returning, I feel like it would make a lot of sense because Ronin is the Ninjago character who Brian Dobson is the most associated with. Plus, to my knowledge, Brian Dobson hasn't actually voiced any character in Dragons Rising yet. So again, I feel like Ronin's chances of returning are fairly likely. Moving on to the police commissioner, I feel like his chances of returning are also fairly likely, given the fact that he's another frequently reoccurring character when it comes to the show, with him making a variety of appearances ever since his debut back during the events of Season 6. I could totally see him showing up at some point in a season of Dragons Rising. Granted, I don't think he'd have a particularly large role if he were to return, but still I could honestly see him returning given his status as a frequently reoccurring character. Moving on to Nelson and Antonia, the big reason why I think their return is likely, or to be more accurate, why I think Nelson's return is likely, is because of Doc Wyatt. Because a while back, a fan actually asked Doc Wyatt if he's thought about the future of Nelson, and Doc Wyatt said that he has. And to me, I feel like this means that when it comes to Nelson's return, it is fairly likely if one of the head writers has thought about the future of this character. Plus, I just think Nelson returning in general is something that would make a lot of sense, given that Nelson is essentially the original Eren when you think about it, given how the two of them were both kids who were big fans of the ninja who were ultimately inspired by them to become ninjas in their own way. Granted, for Nelson, he was an honorary ninja, but the idea is still there. So I think that when it comes to Nelson, his chances of returning are fairly likely, and again, I feel like it would make sense with him essentially being the original Eren, and if Nelson were to show up, then I feel like it's safe to say Antonia would also show up, given how these two have basically been inseparable ever since Antonia's debut back during Season 11. And finally, we have Vanya, and I also think that her return is fairly likely, given how she is another fairly popular character when it comes to the show, with her making pretty frequent appearances, especially during the later half of the Wildbrain era. Not to mention, during the events of Season 13, her and Cole did have a fairly big dynamic during the season, and I could totally see the show bringing her back in order to expand on that dynamic between the two of them, not necessarily expanding into a romantic dynamic between these two, because it has been confirmed that Cole doesn't have any romantic feelings for Vanya, but still, I feel like expanding on their dynamic would make a lot of sense. Plus, I just think it would honestly be really interesting if we got the chance to see how Shintaro was affected by the merge and seeing how things have been with Vanya being the queen of it. I do think that could be something legitimately really interesting to see, and we're just going to have to wait and see if the ninja do return at some point, and if that does happen, it would make a lot of sense for Vanya to return. Moving on, we then have the characters who I think could return in Dragons Rising, and fasten your seatbelt because there's a lot of characters to discuss here, because in total, I believe that there are 12 characters who I think could return in Dragons Rising, with those characters being Cyrus Borg, Bolobo Gravis, Shade, Clutch Powers, Okino, Blazy H Speed, the Uplee, and Benthomar. That is 12 characters in total who I think could return at some point during the events of Dragons Rising. So, starting off with Cyrus Borg, I feel like he could return in Dragons Rising because he is another character who's made frequent appearances across the show, so I feel like that is a reason why he could return. Additionally, given that Cyrus Borg is the creator/father of Pixel, I could see him returning if we end up getting something where Pixel decides to go and find Cyrus Borg. I could see that happening. And also, given how a big role when it comes to Cyrus Borg is obviously him being an inventor, and something that we've seen from him over the years is him building stuff in order to help out the ninja, I could totally see the show continuing on with that if he were to return. Maybe we could see him building some vehicles for the ninja or something. Moving on to the Elemental Masters, when it comes to Gravis and Bolobo, these two are in that third tier of the hierarchy of the Elemental Masters, of the characters who aren't as popular or as prominently used in comparison to the other Elemental Masters. So that's why I don't think their chances of returning are as likely in comparison to some of the other Elemental Masters. I mean, the last time we saw either of these two was over 10 years ago, all the way back during Season 4. However, I don't think their chances of returning are impossible. I mean, I'd say that Camille is also in that third tier, and she returned during Season 2, Part 2. So who knows, maybe we could see the two of them show up at some point. Meanwhile, when it comes to Shade, he's in that second tier of the hierarchy, and the reason why I think his chances aren't as likely as Turner and Karloff is because we do have a new elemental master of Shadow, even though the show calls the element Shade for some reason, with that being Obscuria, and according to Dakwaya, Obscuria is actually Shade's daughter, and that's a big reason why I think Shade's chances of returning aren't as likely, because again, there's a new elemental master of Shade, with that being his daughter. However, we know that when it comes to Shade, he is still alive, so that's why I still feel like he does have a chance of returning, because he isn't dead, unlike some other elemental masters that I will be getting into later. Moving on to Clutch Powers, once again, I feel like he could return at some point because he is another frequently reoccurring character when it comes to the show, with him showing up or being referenced during every single season of the Wildbrain era at one point or another. And yes, I am counting Master of the Mountain because he was referenced during that season, even though he didn't physically appear. And so, given that again, Clutch Powers is a frequently reoccurring character, I could see him appearing. Then again, when it comes to Clutch Powers, he is a fairly unpopular character when it comes to the show, so I could see that as a reason behind why the writers might choose not to bring him back in the show itself. I do know that he appears in a book that was released for Dragons Rsing, but again, when it comes to stuff for these shows specifically, again, him being an unpopular character is a reason that I could see behind why he might not show up at some point. But again, I don't think his chances are impossible. Moving on to Okino and Blazy H. Speed, I feel like these two could return, primarily because of their storylines during the events of Season 12, which revolved around the two of them breaking away from their programming and them ultimately becoming their own people. That was the entire idea behind their stories during the events of Season 12, and I think it could be really interesting if we got the chance to see an expansion on that in Dragons Rsing, where we see the two of them living their lives outside Prime Empire, with them coming into their own and becoming their own people. We saw something like this during the events of Crystallize, with Blazy H. Speed doing what she could in order to help out the ninja, and again, I think it would be really interesting if we got the chance to see an expansion on this during Dragons Rsing. I think that could be pretty cool. Moving on to the Upli, once again, I think they could return at some point during the events of Dragons Rsing, primarily because if the ninja do go back to Shintaro at some point and we see Vanya, I feel like it would also make sense for the Upli to return as well, even though I don't think if they were to return they would have a very large role. I could see them making a cameo appearance or having a semi-large role if they were to return, but again, I don't think they'd have a very large role if they were to return. Plus, not to mention, we do already have a group similar to the Upli in Dragons Rsing, with that obviously being the Finders, but still I feel like the Upli could return, especially since they were essentially the original Finders when you think about it. And finally, we have Benthamar, and once again, I feel like he could return at some point during Dragons Rsing, because just like with Vanya, I think it would be really interesting if we got the chance to see what Merlopia was like following the events of the merge. I think it would honestly be really cool seeing how Merlopia was changed as a result of the merge and seeing what things are like down there with Benthamar as the ruler. I think that could honestly be really cool. Plus, not to mention, if Benthamar were to return, then we could potentially get an answer to a question that the show hasn't actually done anything to address, and that's the question of how did Benthamar become the ruler of the Endless Sea, and how did he get the Moray Guards to side with him, considering just how loyal they were to Calamar during the events of Seabound. This is something that Crystallize didn't do anything to address, and so I do think that it would be nice where if Benthamar did return, we could actually get an answer to this question. And finally, we have the characters who I think won't be returning in Dragons Rsing, and in total, there are 6 characters who I think won't be appearing at some point during Dragons Rsing, with those characters being Ash, Jacob Pevsner, Echo Zane, Scott, Milton Dyer, and Twitchy Tim. I think that all 6 of these characters won't be showing up at some point during the events of Dragons Rsing. When it comes to Ash and Jacob, the big reason why I think these two won't be returning is because they're dead. We know that these two are dead, considering the fact that during Season 2 of Dragons Rsing, we were introduced to new Elemental Masters who had their powers. When it comes to the new Elemental Master of Smoke, obviously we saw that with Cinder, and when it comes to the new Elemental Master of Sound, that was actually the Merlopian who we saw competing in the Tournament of the Sources. They are the new Elemental Master of Sound, and given the way that elemental powers work, where the way an elemental power is passed on to someone else is either an elemental master having a descendant or an elemental master dying and their power seeking out someone else, we know that because of that, when it comes to Ash and Jacob, the two of them are dead because there are new elemental masters who aren't their descendants. Meanwhile, when it comes to Echo Zane, Scott, Milton Dyer, and Twitchy Tim, the big reason why I think these four won't be returning is primarily because I just don't really know what the show could actually do with these characters if they were to return. When it comes to all the other characters who I have discussed, even when it comes to some of the characters who I think could return, I think that there is a way the show could work these characters into the storyline of the show in some way or another. But when it comes to these four characters, I'm gonna be honest, I really don't know how the show could actually fit them into the plot, to be honest with you guys. When it comes to Echo Zane, the show hasn't really done anything with him ever since his debut all the way back during season 6, and that was it. Originally, there was the idea to make Mr. E Echo Zane, but that idea was ultimately shot down and it never happened. And I know there were also people who were theorizing that maybe Mr. F was actually Echo Zane. However, according to Tommy Andreasen, Mr. F was just a regular robot and that was it. And so again, I don't really know what the show could do with him if he were to return. Maybe there could be something involving him and original Zane. I don't know, but either way, again, I'm just not sure what the show can actually do with him. Same thing when it comes to Scott and Milton Dyer. I don't really know what the show could actually do with these two characters if they were to return, because I feel like Prime Empire essentially did everything that could be done when it comes to both these characters, so I don't really know how they could be expanded upon. During my villains video, I did say that I think Unagami could return at some point during Dragons Rising, so maybe that's how Milton Dyer could show up if Unagami were to return. But that's really it. And again, I don't really know what the show could actually do with him if he were to return. And when it comes to Twitchy Tim, it's the exact same thing, as I feel like the island basically did everything that could be done with his character. Maybe there could be some more moments of comedy with him, because Twitchy Tim is essentially a comedic relief character when it comes to the show. But again, in terms of story stuff, I really don't know what could actually be done with these four characters if they were to return. I think it would be nice to see these characters show up again at some point for the people who are fans of these characters and want to see them again. For me personally, I really want to see Echo Zane show up again because I do really like him. But honestly, again, I just don't really know what actually could be done with these characters if they were to appear at some point during Dragons Rising. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So in total, when it comes to the side characters for Ninjago, I believe that there are 3 side characters who will show up at some point during the events of Dragons Rising, 7 side characters who I think are likely to return at some point during Dragons Rising, 9 including Katara and Crag like I brought up earlier. There are 12 characters who I think could return at some point during Dragons Rising, and 6 characters who I think won't be returning during the events of Dragons Rising. Overall, I'd say that when it comes to a lot of the side characters, they do have a pretty good shot of showing up at some point during the events of Dragons Rising. Even when it comes to a lot of the characters who could show up, again, I do honestly think they have a decent shot of appearing at some point during Dragons Rising. And honestly, I don't think there are a lot of side characters who do have a smaller chance of showing up, or again, characters who won't show up. Again, in total, there's only 6 characters who I don't think are going to appear at some point during Dragons Rising, but when it comes to everyone else, I do think that all of them do have a pretty decent chance of appearing at some point. And hopefully we do get to see these characters show up again, as I do think it would be really interesting to see the show expand on their characters. Plus, I just also think it would be nice for the people who are fans of these characters who want to see them show up again at some point, and hopefully that actually happens. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys, so tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to this list, and tell me which characters you guys want to see return at some point in Dragons Rising. Tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.